We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. We are so glad to welcome Xavier Sivels back to the University of Mississippi campus. My original introduction said Mr. Sivels is a PhD candidate at Mississippi State University in Starkville, but I just learned this morning that he defended his dissertation last Tuesday as Dr. Sivels. We first met when he came to do research in the archives and special collections in March of last year, 2023, after being selected as the 2023 Study the South Research Fellow. The fellowship, awarded annually by the Center for the Study of Southern Culture, provides an opportunity for funded research in the collections of the Department of Archives and Special Collections. And Xavier proposed doing research here to explore, quote, how queer African Americans navigated their own unique identities under Jim Crow and engaged wider discourses of gender and sexuality. Dr. Sivels is here today to talk to us about his ongoing research. His dissertation is called Freakish Man, Sexual Blues, Sacred Beliefs, and the Transformation of Black Queer Identity, 1870 to 1957. And it uses Black popular music and religion to trace how Black working class culture changed from accepting and even celebrating queer sexuality in the public sphere to insisting that it remained closeted. His talk today is titled, Ain't I Pretty? Sweet Daddy Grace and the Sacred Blues of the Badman. So please welcome back to the university and to the Center for the Study of Southern Culture, Xavier Sivels.
Hello, everyone. I would like to thank, of course, the Center for the Study of Southern Culture here at the University of Mississippi for inviting me to come today and share a little bit of my research with you all. So today, I will be taking a chapter out of my larger dissertation, which, as you already heard, looks at working class Black queer identity in the early 20th century. But I'm going to look particularly at one figure and one man who was caught up in the intersections of the blues, religion, and gender and sexual identity. An exciting article ran in the July 11th, 1926 edition of the Charlotte Observer. Billed as having a, quote, mean soprano, blues singer Bessie Smith had just come into town. She would be performing on the corner of 2nd and Caldwell Streets. And the Observer compared Smith and the festivities to a previous attraction that was located in the same tent at the same intersection of 2nd and Caldwell Streets. For weeks previously, a quote-unquote wonder-working faith healer had rocked Charlotte into the very heights of religious frenzy. His name was Bishop C.M. Grace. And according to the newspaper, whereas Grace had excited a so-called barbaric religious passion, Smith and her band, the Harlem Frolics, could only hope to exert a similar influence. And though Smith briefly replaced Grace as a star performer in Charlotte that summer, the blues singer and the minister had much more in common than the Observer let on. So from the summer of 1926 until his death in 1959, Charles Manuel Grace made a name for himself as the faith-healing leader of the United House of Prayer for All People, one of the nation's largest African-American Protestant denominations. Claiming to be Christ's successor and sometimes his very equal, Grace actually developed his ministry by organizing it as a charismatic alternative to mainstream Black churches. Taking the title in the church of Sweet Daddy, Grace established widespread support for his ministry amongst Black working class communities in the American Southeast, as well as major urban centers along the Great Migration, by blending two seemingly incongruous charismatic ideals, charismatic Christianity and blues culture. And in that process, Grace merged the Badman archetype, music and atmosphere of the blues, with holiness Pentecostal beliefs and worship. And so the result was a multimillion-dollar religious empire that upended notions of masculinity and blurred divisions between the sacred, the secular, and the downright profane. And as he explained to a Los Angeles reporter in 1958, quote, Nightclubs open up to cut up to the devil every night. So why shouldn't we do the same for the Lord? But before embarking on our survey of Sweet Daddy Grace's career, I think it's important to lay out some very important historical context that kind of gives rise to his ministry. So when Grace arrived in Charlotte, North Carolina in the summer of 1926, Black Protestantism was actually divided over what constituted as appropriate worship. And here, scholars like Wallace Best and Robert Marovich have actually documented how, at the height of the Great Migration, the popularity of so-called sanctified churches was due to mainline groups like the Baptist and the African Methodist Episcopal Church being unwelcoming to what we today consider to be common practices within Black Christianity. Things like emotional worship, shouting, hand clapping, and of course, gospel music, that were actually favored more so by rural Southern migrants. And owing to their shared class roots with the blues and Southern Black working class culture, however, groups like the Memphis-based Church of God in Christ actually encouraged the faithful to sing and dance out their faith and fuse traditional hymns and Negro spirituals with the instrumentation of rhythm and blues as well as jazz. But how do we know this? Well, if we take a page from Mississippi blues artist B.B. King, he actually said, quote, "If you were in the Baptist church, they didn't want you to bring a guitar in. The sanctified church, they didn't care what instrument you played. If you were able to buy one, bring it in, and play spirituals on it, it was perfectly okay." And indicative of this split, we actually have some archival footage showing a typical service at First Baptist Church in North Tulsa, Oklahoma. And though containing no audio, it depicts a very orderly service. We know that they had a professionally trained choir. We know that the congregation would sing traditional hymns, but there was no hand clapping, no shouting, no emotional worship. The most recent work on Sweet Daddy Grace by religious studies scholar Marie Dallum in her 2007 book, Daddy Grace, A Celebrity Preacher and His House of Prayer, has tried to contextualize Grace's ministry along this sacred divide, arguing that at its center, its charismatic worship and beliefs like miraculous faith healing actually associated the house of prayer with wider spread holiness Pentecostalism that was gaining popularity in the early 20th century. And at one level, Dallum was right. The United House of Prayer generally functioned like most other charismatic and sanctified groups. Described in an early service in Charlotte, North Carolina, a reporter actually noted that the worship of Grace's followers resembled, quote, the shimmy, buck and wing, and the Charleston dance. But here, one only needs look toward a snippet of this 1928 newsreel to grasp the aura of Grace's services, and lucky, this one has sound. So again, if you notice from the video, you can kind of parcel out a few things. One, we start off with a traditional sanctified sermon, right? This is actually right before he does a baptism in the James River, close to where I'm from in Smithfield, Virginia, but this revival was in, of course, Newport News, Virginia. You also notice that at the end of kind of his sermon before the baptism, everyone breaks out into what was then known as a ring shout. But there's an interesting twist to it because if you listen, there's actually a jazz band playing in the background. So Grace is actively engaged in blending these seemingly two disparate cultures of, again, the charismatic religion, but also the blues, jazz, and working class secular culture. But despite acknowledging the charismatic appeal of Grace's ministry, Dahlem actually departed from earlier scholars over the persona and figure of Sweet Daddy Grace. According to author Fawcett and others who had kind of looked at Sweet Daddy Grace at the start of his career when it really became popular in about 1940, Grace actually exploited working class blacks' charismatic faith to amass a fortune and create a religion where he was in fact worshipped. However, Dahlem has suggested that such things were only lurid gossip and that negative generalizations only contributed to an unfair criticism of Grace and his followers. However, to fully understand Sweet Daddy Grace's significance to history, as well as the criticism leveled by Fawcett and others, his ministry must be placed within the wider context of sacred and secular black culture in the early 20th century, particularly in the world of the blues that the Charlotte Observer initially noted Sweet Daddy Grace as being a part of. So Sweet Daddy Grace's rise to success also coincided with the expansion of black public culture between about 1900 and 1930. And so in the secular world represented by Bessie Smith in the Harlem Frolics' 1926 performances in Charlotte, the blues was taking the nation by storm. Advancements like the rise of recorded music, the establishment of a market for black performers, as well as the marketing of so-called race records performed by black artists for black audiences by major companies like Paramount and OK, the blues would evolve from informal performances in disparate areas across the South to commercial entertainment. Likewise, black leisure and entertainment venues blossomed, evolving from the rural juke joints of the Mississippi Delta to urban saloons in Memphis on Beale Street, as well as nightclubs as far north as Harlem's Cotton Club. And so, owing to its roots in working class Southern black culture, however, the blues maintained a theme of disaffection and disillusion with mainstream society despite its widespread commercialization during this period. And here, scholars like Adam Gusso, Cecil Brown, and John W. Roberts have actually traced the blues' irreverence through one particular figure, that figure being the Badman, or the folkloric anti-hero that inverted traditional racist stereotypes of, quote, the out-of-control black man, the surly slacker, and the belligerent troublemaker. And so the Badman's uninhibited hedonism, braggadocious swagger, as well as his willingness to challenge mainstream laws and norms in the context of Jim Crow made him a hero worthy of multiple Badman ballads and early blues songs. And so the Badman was actually reflected and presented as a flamboyant working class hustler most times. And so according to historical evidence compiled by Cecil Brown, St. Louis hustler Lee, also known as Stagger Lee Shelton, wore a pair of dove-colored spats, tailored shoes, gray striped pants, a black coat, and red velvet vest on the night that he killed Billy Lyons, in which we would get the infamous tale of Stagger Lee. And in the 1920s and 1930s, such men were synonymous with the blues and working class black spaces of leisure, and they also got a lot of new names. They were known as sweetbacks, sweet papas, daddies, and also sweet daddies. We know this because in his 1929 Crooked Man Blues, for example, Willie Baker actually sang the lyrics, quote, tell all you women how to make a happy home. Keep your working man and leave those sweet boys alone. But we also know this because another blues singer that year by the name of Frankie Half Pint Jackson, in his song It's Heated, said that he saw, quote, the sweetbacks and the strutters all raising sand when he went down Michigan Avenue and came up grand. And so in light of all of this, getting us back to Sweet Daddy Grace and how he kind of reflects the Badman, many black churches, particularly sanctified churches during this period, actually saw the blues as the devil's music. However, Sweet Daddy Grace embraced the Badman and blues culture in his ministry. Particularly, he physically embodied the Badman's flamboyance throughout his career. So as we can see here in the photo on the left, taken during a church service in 1958, Grace's wardrobe matched that of Stagger Lee's. If we could see this picture in color, which unfortunately it is not, we would be able to appreciate what multiple media articles reported as his tailor-made suits of lush fabrics in vibrant colors and decorated with gold piping or shiny buttons, brightly striped vests, a custom-made Stetson, and hand-painted neckties. But also musically, the United House of Prayer stood out with its multi-piece brass shout bands that, as we saw in the clip from 1929, but as well as these pictures on the right side of the screen from 1945, again, a service in Newport News, Virginia, Grace actually incorporated much of the music of the Badman, the blues, and jazz into his religious services. And this music would routinely send worshipers into a sight and state of religious ecstasy. And though he had established a charismatic ministry, Grace's embodiment of the Badman would also become central to building his popularity by making him legible to many of his working class congregants who ultimately were as steeped in blues culture as they were in the church. So though he would ultimately blossom in the United States South, Sweet Daddy Grace's story actually started thousands of miles away from it. Born Marcelino Manuel de Graca, he arrived in New Bedford, Massachusetts from Cape Verde in May of 1904. And in 1909, he married fellow Cape Verdean Jane Lombard after a brief courtship. And Jane would later explain that her uncle had simply threw them together, and that Grace, quote, made eyes, smiled at me, and swept me away. But their romance would soon turn bitter. First on Grace's mind during this period was actually coming up in the world and doing it as fast as possible and by any means necessary. He described these years of his life as, quote, studying, working, and traveling, everywhere I had to. And so in 1910, he would do this by changing his name to Charles Grace, but he would also hold a various amount of jobs. He was a seasonal cranberry picker, he was a cook, a railway worker, and also a salesman and a grocer. And as he moved from job to job, apparently Grace also moved from woman to woman. And during his time away from the home on the road, as a railway cook as well as a cranberry picker, Jane eventually alleged that Charles had actually left her and their 2 children for a whole nother woman. And the couple would ultimately divorce in 1920, and on the actual divorce filing, Grace would cite infidelity as the reason. However, Grace was not alone in his romantic strife, disaffectedness, and wanderlust. This was also a common theme of the blues, particularly traveling bluesmen. Because tightly regulated under the years of slavery, freedom of movement became an important symbol of blacks by the turn of the 20th century. And in the blues, singers would often depict themselves as ramblers engaged in traveling and various forms of transience as a means of both personal and economic freedom. And to this end, blues singer Major Johnson summed up the listlessness spirit of the blues in the song Traveling Man Blues, where he said, quote, I'm a traveling man mama, sure got a traveling mind. Gonna buy me a ticket and move on down the line. And so for Charles, too, refusal to be pinned down ran very deep because he didn't really want to be idle anywhere, as he specifically said several years later, whether that was in love, finances, or freedom. And so he simply moved on down the line. And ultimately, this would land him in the pulpit of all places. In 1922, he claimed that the call of God had brought him to New Bedford to establish a church, though he had been there for over a decade previously. And he explained to a local newspaper that year that his church offered miraculous cures and revelations of the Spirit of the Holy Ghost, unlike, quote, many of the so-called Christians belonging to the Church of Reverend Dr. Somebody rather than the Church of God. However, just being called by God would not be enough for Charles Grace to make it as a minister in New England. And so, between 1923 and 1924, he embarked on an 8-month trip to the Holy Lands. And while there, he claimed that many came, quote, deaf, lame, and paralyzed to be healed by him. However, he placed himself instead of God, or Christ, at the center of many of these early testimonies. He had performed the same miracles and drew the same crowds as Christ, going so far as to pose for a photo, as you can see here on the right side of the screen, holding bread and loaves by the Sea of Galilee to show that he was actually at the same spot of Christ. And when he returned to New Bedford to evangelize locals, however, Charles Grace was reportedly ridiculed by a service that he held in nearby Harwich, Massachusetts. But we don't know the exact reason for locals' negative responses to Grace. However, some available evidence can make this somewhat clearer. Boasting of his experience abroad, he claimed, quote, "I came away so filled with the Spirit of God that it would be worth many more times the money." Now, during that time, a trip to the Holy Lands was not cheap. A 1925 travel brochure from the American-based Red Star Line listed the cheapest third-class ticket at $82.50. And so in today's money, that's roughly $14,000 and some change. And this was compared to the fact that many of Grace's early followers in his early congregation that was established at 357 Kempton Street was actually in an area of New Bedford called the West End that was home to generally working class people. That included mill workers, carpenters, and firemen who probably couldn't afford to go on this trip themselves. But as Charles Grace, now a divorced laborer turned preacher, he had tried his hand at charismatic religion in New England, but it simply didn't translate well. Ever the transient, however, Grace simply moved on down the line. He would reinvent himself through a series of revivals in the United States South, the main area where he would become popular. And in a region where charismatic religion and the blues had their roots, he found an audience that was receptive and eager to hear his message. So the logistics of early House of Prayer revivals placed Grace at the intersection of sacred and secular cultures. Taking his ministry to major cities in the American Southeast like Charlotte, North Carolina, Norfolk, Virginia, and Savannah, Georgia between 1926 and 1929, Grace's Southern debut shared space and culture with what was then known as the Chitlin Circuit, or a network of Black entertainment venues stretching from the Deep South to major cities in the North. And if we recall the Charlotte Observer's 1926 article, Grace's tent would also be used by a blues singer by the name of Bessie Smith. And her arrival in the South was part of this longer tradition of Black tent shows that brought entertainment to Southern audiences. Bridging things like vaudeville and minstrelsy with the blues and early jazz, however, these shows also became markers of success for Blacks by performing the latest in entertainment as well as being commercially successful. And to this end, the Bessie Smith Review would make as much as $600 a week in 1925. But it was in the South that Grace would adapt many of the tactics of tent show performers to actually popularize his early ministry. He traveled in this thing called a gospel car, which was plastered with Bible verses, a figure of Grace as an angel, which you can make out here at the top of the Chevrolet, as well as words of religious warning and repentance. Also, Grace would send assistants ahead of him to announce his arrival and circulate handbills in towns, and even had some of his followers play music on street corners to attract attention and invite onlookers into his tent. But at the same time, Grace could slip into more dubious methods to garner attention. In April of 1926, he actually ran an ad in the Savannah Tribune that depicted him as a biblical prophet. Claiming to be, quote, Bishop Grace from the Holy Lands, he wore elaborate robes and sported a long beard that he had grown during his time abroad. And Grace provided for his readers, as well as his potential congregants, what he called an old-time camp meeting by juxtaposing something that wasn't necessarily true, he was not at all from Jerusalem, with the familiar themes of religious revival that were sweeping throughout the South. What is more, Grace's early sermons reportedly introduced a bit of crass humor. According to a report by the Charlotte News that July, Grace commanded in one nightly sermon, quote, "Every one of you sisters would know she's a heifer, raise your hand." In Black vernacular, the term heifer referred to women, particularly those who were promiscuous, unruly, or otherwise downcast, which clearly was not commonly used in a pulpit for obvious reasons. But where it was commonly used, openly discussed, and at times embraced, was in the blues and working class juke joints. In his song, Young Heifer Blues, for example, Moses Andrews extolled the virtues of his young female lover. But evidently for Charles Grace, Bishop Grace from the Holy Lands, this tactic would work to his advantage. Because at the end of the service, according to the Charlotte News, Grace invited all those whose previous religious experiences had, quote, not been satisfactory to follow his ministry. And in that one night, about 400 people under the tent answered his call and joined his church. But beyond his showmanship, Grace's ministry took off in the South because of his ability to blend working-class Black charismatic faith with the secular world of the blues. Early on, he established himself as a faith healer, taking a lesson from his early trip to the Holy Lands, which had cost him an audience and ridicule in New England. Grace would actually make sure in the South that his miracles could be easily validated. While on tour, he published the names and addresses of those healed at his early services in places like Savannah, Georgia. So if you look here on the very top right of this article, for example, one Elizabeth McGill of 1011 West 37th Street in Savannah was allegedly healed, according to Grace, of her rheumatism through a so-called anointed handkerchief. But we also see at the same time that Grace proselytized those commonly left out of religious circles. Because according to the Charlotte Observer in November of that year, Grace not only attracted the sanctified crowd, but he also appealed to the class that, quote, does not attend any church but loiters around in the streets. And 2 years later, a local house of prayer minister from Charlotte would tell the Charlotte News himself that many of the former members had, quote, been in gambling dens, buying and selling moonshine, and living generally destituted lives before they encountered Charles Manuel Grace. But how did he succeed in converting these people who were previously unchurched by many churches? In his early ministry, Charles Grace would adopt this Badman's art of signifying to validate his spiritual authority. The art of signifying was the manipulation of the meaning of words so that an entirely different meaning and idea could be expressed, a form of doublespeak. Blues musicians often invoke the signifying Badman in everything from boasting about their devious and two-timing ways, talking about downcast lovers, but also to references of the mystical and narratives of badmen like Stagger Lee, who, according to one early version, quote, only had ways like a natural man. And Grace would also build himself as a signifying man with only ways of the natural. After rejection by the people of Rock Hill, South Carolina in 1926, Grace claimed to have called down a terrible storm on the night of November 27th, saying, quote, I brought disaster to places where I was mistreated. I'm not afraid of anybody, leaving slightly ambiguous whether or not he had actually caused the storm or simply prayed for it. But the combined effect of his charismatic worship services, faith healing, and early adaptation of blues culture in the Badman was that Grace ultimately succeeded in casting a wide popular net in the American Southeast by the close of the 1920s. On September 12th of 1926, he baptized over 600 people at Clinton Lake in Charlotte, North Carolina alone. An additional 5,000 spectators crowded around just to watch. In Washington, D.C., a year later, he would baptize 1,500. And so Grace successfully branded himself in this period as a faith healer and established several permanent local churches in the Southeast, including in Savannah and Charlotte in 1926, but also in Newport News, Virginia, and Norfolk in the following year. And at the center of it all, however, was this very eclectic personality. After coming home one day in Charlotte, North Carolina in September of 26, local laborer Paul Bozeman Sr. asked his wife Lindy if she had brought any groceries for himself, her, and their 3-year-old son, Paul Jr. He had given her $2. Lindy replied no. And so when Paul Sr. asked her why, she simply pointed to a photo of Sweet Daddy Grace on the wall and exclaimed, "That's the man I believe in. That's the man I gave my money to." While we don't know the exact photo of Grace that Lindy had purchased that night in the tent on 2nd and Caldwell Streets, One can imagine it was a devotional image like the one now displayed on the screen. Though archival records of the Bozeman's are very scant, two things can actually be garnered from the story printed in the Charlotte News. One, evidenced by Paul Sr.'s desire to divorce over a mere $2, the family was clearly under tight financial strains. What is more, Lindy Bozeman's clear desire to give those last $2 to Grace because he was simply the man she believed in didn't suggest a naive following that early scholars like Arthur Fawcett lodged at Grace and his members. It was simply a matter of faith for Lindy and others. Grace was the healer, miracle worker, and the man that she believed in. And as Grace began to spread his ministry within and beyond the South from the 1930s forward, this would become more and more of a trend, yielding to promotional photographs like this that simply said that Grace was followers' light, joy, and ultimately their very salvation. However, part of this meant that Grace would have to adopt a new name. So if you're keeping track, he was first CM Grace, then he was Bishop Grace from the Holy Lands, but we now have a new one. Closing out a nightly service in Charlotte, he asked his followers, quote, "Am I your daddy? Ain't you all got a nice daddy?" And so he would get the name Daddy Grace. But in the world that existed outside of the house of prayer, particularly the world steeped in the blues and secular culture, daddy didn't always mean your father, particularly in the South. It also applied to men in areas of secular culture engaged in professions like hustling, gambling, but also irregular sexual lovers. And this stood completely opposite to the morals endorsed by many sanctified churches. And early on, many actually began to associate Grace with this more subversive meaning of the term daddy. At the height of one service in Georgia in the 1930s, WPA reporters noticed that a congregant, quote, laid on the rough board floor, her jaws hanging open, crying, praise Daddy Grace." Observing a later service in 1944, Arthur Fawcett noted a distinct, quote, sex motive in shouting in the house of prayer. He said, quote, "I heard a preacher call out to the followers who were chiefly women. Who has the best thing you ever did see? I mean the best feeling you ever did feel. You feel it from your head down to your feet. If you don't know what I mean, it makes you feel good. It makes everybody feel good. Sweet daddy, oh sweet daddy, daddy, you feel so good." But instead of expressing emotions in worship towards God or Christ, as we can see here in this picture taken again from Life magazine in 1945, Grace's followers seemingly identified their sweet daddy as a source of physical ecstasy and joy. And this seemingly mirrored, at least for Fawcett and others, the sexual undertones of daddies in blues songs. But also, Grace's role as the motive for church members shouting and the associated appraisal it garnered from his contemporaries was further influenced by certain rituals and practices within the house of prayer. One practice was the replacing of the name Jesus with Daddy in many of their hymns. Speaking to members' absolute dependence on Grace's power, for example, the lyrics of one song reportedly went, quote, "Daddy is the only savior, the world's chief cornerstone. While he's with us, we'd better obey. The world will end when he is gone." And as we saw in the early devotional poster, it was a standard practice, if not a printed and public practice within the house of prayer, to refer to Grace in a manner traditionally reserved for God or Christ. But this practice would only grow as Grace grew popular towards the end of his life. And if you look here in this photograph, which is depicting Grace towards the end of his life in the late 1950s at the church's headquarters in Washington, D.C., you see Grace sitting on what was called the throne of grace on top of the holy mountain in the church. This is the space reserved exclusively for Grace and now his 3 or 4 successors, if I'm keeping count correctly. No one else can sit on this area but the bishop. But if you look at the very back, there is this picture that we traditionally think of as the Sacred Heart of Jesus Christ, a traditional piece of Catholic imagery. But if you look closely, superimposed on Jesus' face is a younger Charles Grace, and at the very bottom it even says, in case you didn't know who he was, Daddy Grace. So, as sweet daddy of the house of prayer, a worker of miracles, Grace became worthy of receiving this and other honors in the minds of his followers. Writing in the church's official publication, Grace Magazine, in 1948, one follower reported that she had, quote, been blessed by Grace with the Holy Ghost and fire by eating a peanut from the Savior's sweet hands. But at the same time, Grace's alleged powers and role within the church also made him eligible to receive massive financial gifts from members. His arrival in town for services were marked by large parades of uniformed and celebrating members that culminated in the presentation of elaborate cash love offerings. So if we look here on the screen, you get a composite image of a regular arrival of Grace in many of his congregations in the Southeast. So here on the far left, we actually have what is an advertisement that was ran in a local newspaper in Columbia, South Carolina, weeks in advance, pretty much detailing the order of events. There would be a parade, there would be a fair oftentimes outside of the church with games, food trucks for members and the general public to enjoy. There would also be a large parade, which is pictured here in the middle. This one took place in the 1950s in Norfolk, Virginia, where members would put on their finest. There would be marching bands, majorettes, and there would be a big float with Daddy Grace sitting on it. People would throw him money, he would throw candy to the children, and he would also be fanned by two of his female attendants. But the most penultimate moment of the service, or the series of events for members, were the services where Grace would actually preach. Again, he is their light, their joy, and their salvation. So in this final image that was printed in Jet magazine in about 1955 or 1966, there's a member presenting her love gift to Sweet Daddy. If you notice, it's a basket made entirely out of money, and according to Jet magazine, both the dollar bills that made up the basket as well as the money inside of it totaled to about $700. And again, this is just from one of his members. For members, it was an honor and a privilege to bestow gifts upon Grace in recognition of his spiritual power. In Savannah, Georgia, for example, a deacon was quoted by reporters to have told followers it was a blessing to, quote, raise $40 for Daddy Grace. While the prophet still sits on the throne, let us all contribute freely to him. And so as his fame rose, Sweet Daddy Grace began to spend lavishly. He purchased a Cuban plantation in 1936, as well as a $20,000 mansion in New Bedford, Massachusetts in 1943, amongst other properties not only within the North or outside of the United States, but also in the South. In each one of the cities where he had his churches, he would have a main residence where he would reside during his time there. But all of this was paid for with the money given to him by his followers, as well as the fact that it was paid for with church funds, that according to the church's 1928 Constitution, he was the sole executive authority over. Nobody could tell him what to do with the church's money. And to an extent, Grace's financial ventures did benefit the church. At his residences, like the Grace Village Apartments in Norfolk, Virginia, pictured on the screen, he employed members as live-in staff and allowed followers to live there as well, provided that they pay him rent through his business manager. So if you see here, you can see the Grace Village Apartments, and at the very top, there's a picture of Grace being attended by one of the church followers. Also, the United House of Prayer featured many projects addressing material needs for the members of the community. For example, in 1930, he established the Family Aid Association, which was a burial insurance program for impoverished church members. However, it was not uncommon for Grace's displays of wealth and benevolence to take on a seemingly derogatory tone. After purchasing the mansion of a rival evangelist by the name of Prophet Jones, Jet magazine reporters visited Grace in his well-appointed mansion in Washington, D.C.'s exclusive Logan Circle in 1956. And what they saw can only be described as a bizarre scene. There were about some 50 followers, young and old, lined up as Grace ate breakfast to pay between $1 and $5 for bits of food of toast and salmon cakes from his breakfast. And commenting on his rival's recent downfall, Grace claimed, quote, I don't drag or show off my clothes, but I know they're paid for when I get them. And so Grace then proceeded to get a maid, who was also one of his followers, to get his new Alaskan seal fur coat, which he promptly modeled for reporters and photographers. Then, the Jet magazine article concludes with this brief vignette. Grace began to toss crumbs on the floor to show his benevolence to his members, looked the reporters in the eye, and said, quote, "We're humble. We'll even eat off the floor for Sweet Daddy." And so, as a wider cultural symbol in Black folk culture, as well as the blues, according to scholars like Lawrence Levine, the Badman pretty much operated along two models, either that of a moral hard man that opposed dominant society, so a sort of anti-hero as it were, or a simple hard man that broke both mainstream norms but also harmed the Black community. We know this because an older version of Stagger Lee carried the lines, quote, "Stagger Lee was a bully man, and everybody knowed. When they seed Stagger Lee coming, they give Stagger Lee the road. Oh, that man, bad man Stagger Lee done come." And when it came to finances and the general operations of the United House of Prayer, it appeared that Sweet Daddy Grace, as a hustler bad man, potentially ebbed between these two modes. At a 1935 service in Newport News, Virginia, for example, he became irate when the choir came up short on their love gift. He halted the service and reportedly launched into a lambast from his pulpit called, again, the Holy Mountain. Reporters said he said, quote, "I know why you couldn't give me but $12. You gave it all to the white man from whom you bought those robes." But even beyond this, in matters of faith, Grace applied a sort of bad man or hustler mentality to finances. Owing to his career history as a salesman, he sold a wide range of blessed items throughout his career, starting in his early ministry in Charlotte in the late 1920s, that, when applied to the body or placed in the home, reportedly could enact healing. One was the so-called Grace magazine, which could be worn or carried on the body to promote physical healing, but also could be read and studied for wisdom and insight. And so one unnamed follower from Augusta, Georgia, when she was interviewed in 1952, claimed that she actually drank water from a jar under the bed that contained a very small piece of Grace magazine in it. And also, if you look at this particular edition of Grace magazine from August of 1948, you can get a general idea of the beliefs of the United House of Prayer. You have kind of the scales of life, good and evil. Of course, on the uptick is the United House of Prayer. At the bottom is the world going down in sin. But in the middle, there's this angelic figure that is a representation of Daddy Grace. And so there's a way of potentially reading this where in the very axis, the very center of this weighing scale, Grace potentially held the balances of good and evil and the keys to the kingdom of heaven, as it were, in his own hands. However, if you look even closer at this particular edition of Grace magazine, you'll see that divine healing, salvation, and knowledge through Daddy Grace that the magazine offered came at a very interesting price, that of a free will offering. So Sweet Daddy Grace's seeming fixation with profit would routinely garner him criticism throughout his career. In 1939, for example, Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. surmised that Grace's ministry was, quote, "nothing to it, just another in a long line of imposters who have only each lasted for a very brief season." But as we know, Grace's ministry lasted more than just a brief season. It lasted roughly 40 decades. It specifically relied on the genuine charismatic faith of his followers. That cannot be questioned. It was charismatic faith, after all, that caused Lindy Bozeman to give her very last dime to the church, or for other members to actually ingest the Grace magazine. But it was also his distinct public image that Grace would use to signify the bad man in the most clearest terms. Beyond his financial relationship with members, Sweet Daddy Grace's role as a bad man was evident in his numerous scandals, as well as the fact that he was often maligned by his critics. In the early 20th century, Black culture, both sacred and secular, swirled with anxieties over the specter of religious bad men known as jacklegs, or ministers with little to no formal training and associated with the exploitation of congregations. In cinema, film director Oscar Michaud's 1925 film Body and Soul actually depicted the fictional Reverend Isaiah T. Jenkins, played by the incomparable Paul Robeson, as an escaped prisoner and drunk who, passing himself off as a minister, conned a local Southern congregation and ultimately assaulted fatally the female lead. But also in the blues, the jackleg was a common topic of discussion. In 1932, for example, Bolton, Mississippi country blues group, the Mississippi Sheiks, took the issue head on in the song He Calls That Religion. In one of the lines, the Sheiks detailed the private life of a local minister saying, quote, well, the preacher used to preach just to save souls, but now he's preaching just to buy Jelly Roll. And so Sweet Daddy Grace's role as a bad man seemingly fit this trend when in 1934, it was revealed that he had an alleged predatory relationship with female followers. That February, he was charged with transporting a 21-year-old member of his congregation to his residences in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. for illicit sex, violating what was then known as the Mann Act. The victim in question, Minnie Lee Campbell, had been a United House of Prayer member, avid piano player, but also she allegedly had given birth to Grace's child. While on the road with Sweet Daddy, Campbell alleged in the case that he had threw her down on the back of the chauffeured Packard limousine that was being driven and assaulted her. And then when Grace later demanded that she, quote, come up to his room, Campbell claimed that he gave her $5. So like the subject of the Mississippi Sheiks' 1932 record, it appeared that Grace, too, had bought some Jelly Roll from behind the pulpit. He had used an automobile, a house, and cash financed by House of Prayer members to prey on one of his followers, allegedly. And so, what is more, however, the case ultimately highlighted his status as a countercultural preacher with Badman appeal, not necessarily just because he had been engaged in a sexual scandal, but his actual conduct during the trial. Not only did he arrive at his arraignment in a, quote, heavy limousine of expensive make, but he paid the $9,000 bail in cold, hard cash. After he was found guilty a month later after the trial, he appeared before a crowd, not in Harlem, not in Philadelphia, but in Norfolk, Virginia, to declare, quote, I am convicted. Why then do you follow me? Why not go to some other church? Was Jesus Christ not convicted? End quote. Not only had he performed the miracles and fashioned himself in the likeness of Christ, again, if we're tracking this from his early career in 1926 after he comes back from the Holy Lands, but he had also now been persecuted unjustly. And according to Grace, if he was a bad man, perhaps Christ was the original bad man. Ultimately, the charges from the case would be dropped due to a technicality of jurisdiction, which for Grace and his followers was just another testament to his divine status, but also his bad man outmatching of the law. However, the scandals didn't stop here. They would continue for the rest of his life. While performing a wedding in 1934, he made an indecent proposal from his silk-draped throne in his church in Baltimore to impress a bridal kiss upon the bride. And according to the Baltimore Afro-American, both of the newlyweds declined. That holiday season, he surrendered himself into federal custody on the charge of evading taxes on a total of about $195,000 in income. And when he went before the federal judge, he paid that $5,000 bond in cold hard cash. But even up until the last years of his life, they would ultimately be marred by scandals that would even endear him even more to his followers. In September of 1954, Jet reported the sensational news that Grace had married and abandoned one Lavinia Royster. She was suing at the time for decades of non-support for her and her adult daughter. And according to the jilted bride, the relationship followed the brief course of his first marriage to Jane Lombard. They had a very quick courtship and marriage in 1923, a move to Florida, and a child by 1925, and ultimately desertion by Grace in 1928, during the time when he was traveling up and down the Southeast conducting revivals. But even more interesting was that providing a letter from his first wife, Jane, the judge actually tried to engage in this conversation about Grace's infidelities. However, when Grace was presented with the letter in court by the judge, he denied ever being married to Jane Lombard. Providing a simple explanation for the letter, his defense attorney claimed, quote, "All the time, women come in Daddy's house and they claim that they are his wives." And despite these and other major blows to his character, Grace's membership stayed firm, his popularity grew, and at one point during the 1954 trial, the judge actually had to legally bar members from, quote, "pressing folded money into Daddy's well-oiled hand," as the prophet stepped out of his chauffeured car onto a red velvet carpet laid by his followers, wearing a purple suit with gold trimming and gold accents. So now we get to the title, wrapping this up with gender and sexuality. At the height of his career, Sweet Daddy Grace's life aligned more with the daddies of the secular Badman and the blues, and their more nefarious meanings. And in the process of making himself Sweet Daddy in the House of Prayer and pulpit Badman, however, he transgressed the Badman's hypermasculine roots. Specifically, he would wear clothes and consume luxury items in extreme excess, upending conventional understandings of masculinity and manhood. Throughout his career, he would be known for wearing very gaudy, if not outlandish outfits. For example, when he was photographed at his Cuban villa of all places in 1953, he sported a white three-piece suit with contrasting piping and gold buttons, a jeweled tie clip, a diamond ring, perhaps the same ring he was wearing in this picture in Norfolk, Virginia in 1958, as well as proudly displaying each of his custom-made Stetson hats. However, his clothes reflected his personal taste and wealth, as well as aligned him with the secular Badman. Since Reconstruction and through the blues, depictions of bad men in gaudy clothing came to symbolize their status as sporting men who existed in the world of jukes and nightclubs. And the style of this hustling culture, according to historian and social critic Robin D.G. Kelly, countered the impoverishment and alienating labor of Jim Crow, with Stetson hats becoming a major signature of the Badman. We know this because central to the story of Stagger Lee was his Stetson hat, the very thing he shot Billy Lyons over. However, this Badman and hustler-inspired style ultimately attracted Grace's followers to him. As one follower, Earthelene Watson, proudly proclaimed in Grace magazine in 1952, "Our daddy creates his own style, and he gives us the very best of everything." But Grace would take this even further, because as his followers grew, reaching some 120,000 in 31 cities alone in North Carolina by 1960, so did his wealth and his outlandishness. According to reporters, during a 1955 service, he sported again an enormous diamond ring, shoulder-length gray curls, and now a mustache that was penciled in with eyebrow pencil. But he also had 4-inch long fingernails on his left hand, painted red, white, and blue, an example of which we can see here. And as he explained to the reporters, nobody can grow them as long. But for Grace, he claimed that he kept the nails on his right hand shorter because he needed to write and sign checks. And so this boast were claims of both individuality but also Badman signifying. Simply, Sweet Daddy Grace had plenty of money, and he didn't have to work hard to get it. And so, throughout his career, Charles Manuel Grace was variably described as a cult leader, as a charlatan, and as a jackleg. But to his followers, he was just plain Sweet Daddy Grace. And at the center of this persona was a flamboyant pulpit Badman. And having gone from CM Grace merely at the spot of Christ to Sweet Daddy Grace convicted like Christ, Grace established his ministry primarily in the American Southeast. And by doing so, he engaged in aspects of blues culture and the Badman narrative. And to followers, this extravagant fashion, wealth, and penchant for scandal, everything that made him Sweet Daddy, to create this religious counterculture simply made sense. Thank you.